The story begins with our MC pointing to a specific location on the map. His father clarifies that it is not the place he is referring to, and stated that there's a tiny territory which is like a bean at the very edge. Grace couldn't believe that there's still territory far up. Grace's father praises him for finding the territory, and even told him that he had expected as much from his son. Grace comments how the territory is extremely small compared to the rest of their country. Grace's father turns serious and informs him that from tomorrow he will be the lord of that tiny territory. Confused and puzzled, Grace asks his father to wait. Not wanting to become the lord of such a place, Grace offers to even lick his father's shoes or anything. Hearing his father only responding, Grace knew that it was no use speaking to him as his father had stopped listening to him. Grace's brother Kyle approached Grace and told him to take what their father has given him positively, pointing out how Grace could use it as a chance to become a lord. Turning around, Grace mutters, "Brother Kyle." Grace states that lord or not, the place he is supposed to rule is the farthest land called Asgard. No matter how Grace wants to be positive about it, he just couldn't do it. Grace believes that being banished from the country would not be an exaggeration to describe the measure. Grabbing Grace's shoulder, Kyle tells him that he is weak and that he is in no position to complain. The comment pissed Grace off, and he thought of his brother as someone truly useless. The king of the country stated that Kyle has become a holy magician, and Georg, Grace's other brother, has achieved the title of sword saint. The king turns to Grace, asking him what he has achieved. Grace was told that if he can show some kind of power, his father might change his mind. Annoyed, Grace shares that he already has a plan that he had been working on recently. This intrigued everyone at first, but when they saw Grace holding a hoe, their curiosity turned to confusion. When Grace was asked what is the meaning of that after mentioning the hoe, Grace clarifies that it is not just an ordinary hoe. Grace's talent, which is called World Library, has the power to gain various knowledge from a library in another dimension. Based on the knowledge gained there, Grace stated that he had a blacksmith make what one might call an enhanced hoe. The enhanced hoe simply doubles the efficiency of farm work. Grace believes that by distributing it to the farmers, it would lead to increased food production. However, Grace's brother Georg was not having it and decided to break Grace's enhanced hoe. Shocked, Grace asked Georg what he was doing. Georg reiterated what their father had said, and that is for Grace to show power. Asking Grace about the hoe and production, the king reminded Grace once again that if there's no bread, then he will just have to take one. Opening the window, which has the full view of their kingdom, the king tells Grace to look at their vast Vermillion Kingdom, and how royals like them have led the charge in battle. Land, technicians, people, everything that they lack. They took it by force and grew a large kingdom by using them. Taking off their clothes and showing their upper body, the king mentions that their family, the Vermillion royalty, must always be the symbol of power. The king asks Grace what he is doing, and why he isn't using his knowledge power to strengthen his physical or magical power. With a sad look, Grace responded that if he was able to do that, he would have done it long ago. The king states that it is the very reason why he is sending Grace to Asgard, since he does not see Grace to be useful for anything else. Until Grace completes the development of Asgard, his father won't allow him to return to the royal capital. Even if Grace were to gain knowledge to enhance himself, any enhancement wouldn't work since he was originally weak and couldn't even wield a sword. With the little magic power Grace has, he also couldn't use magic either. Different from his family, Grace turned to studying, which he liked. Grace's family wasn't always like that and even used to have high hopes for him because he was so studious. His family's attitude changed when Grace's talent was discovered. In their country, where power is everything, Grace was given a non-combat skill and was deemed unnecessary. Even so, at that moment, Grace felt incredibly cheerful. Raising both of his arms, Grace states how he is now free. After parting ways with his barbaric, power-obsessed nation, Grace sensed the liberation is much stronger. However, Grace still has one more thing he is concerned about, which is the place he will be ruling Asgard. Still, Asgard, says Grace, as he now ventures to his new territory. Grace immediately notices how terrible the road is, and even questioned if it was a place that people used to live at. Accompanying Grace is the royal guard knight, Vigna, asking him what kind of place Asgard looks like. Even though they're supposed to be a royal entourage, in the end it was just the two of them, and no one else came along. Grace mutters as he then asks Vigna why she came along knowing that much. Well, yeah, says Vigna, as she reminds Grace of the promise she made with him when they were still children and when Grace was often sick. Vigna repeats those exact same words. I'll protect Grace. To come on such a dangerous journey for such a reason, Grace was just speechless. Responding to Vigna, Grace stated that he is now old enough and no longer needed her protection. Vigna asks Grace why he is so stubborn, to which Grace responds that he isn't, and that he is just strong. The door to the carriage suddenly opens and both Vigna and Grace were told to stop flirting inside and leave everything to the coachman. Hearing this, Vigna panicked as she couldn't believe that the coachman had told them that they were flirting. Bowman, the dwarf blacksmith, tells Grace how he has it rough for ruling Asgard. Grace reassures Bowman that he is fine, but then asks Bowman if he is okay journeying with them. Grace knows that it's not easy to become a national exclusive blacksmith, and that Bowman didn't have to give that title up to come with him. Bowman admits that the title sounded impressive, but in reality, everyone made Bowman work all night making nothing but weapons. This led to Bowman having nightmares. Hearing that, Grace tells Bowman that he is always welcome in his territory. What also got the two in the mess was the hoe that Grace proposed, which Bowman made and was just easily destroyed. Remembering how the hoe was destroyed 5 seconds after the unveiling, Grace was barely managing to hold off his anger. Bowman states how the hoe was lamentable, and that the rest of the royal family didn't understand the hoe's value. Changing back the topic, Vigna asks Grace about Asgard. "Oh, right," says Grace, as he remembered that they were in the middle of that question. Since Grace wanted to get a detailed understanding as well, he decides to use his talent, summoning his world library, and orders it to disclose information on Asgard. The world library welcomes Grace, as it guides him to the location of the documents. Asgard was a nation said to have been ruled by the Mad King Suzi. With flying ships and exploding devices, it's said that Asgard has developed itself to become a country with unseen technologies. Hearing that, Vigna becomes excited as she tells Grace that it sounded amazing, and what is even more incredible is that Grace is the lord of such a place. Grace agrees with Vigna, but he isn't pleased at all, as he reveals that the country itself has already fallen. Suzi had a mysterious power to create anything, but the Mad King never shared his methods. Those techniques that Suzi used remained shrouded in mystery. After the Mad King's death, Asgard quickly fell, or so it's said. In other words, Grace and the others' destination is, in a sense, just ruins. What concerns Grace more is that to everything that he said, none of those are the worst. Thanks to Suzi's leftover powerful golems killing off every visitor, the country has now become a demon realm where no one dares to set foot. When Vigna said, "What's that all about?" Grace asked her if she was now having second thoughts. Grace tells Vigna that it is what happens when she comes along without doing any research. When Grace stated that there was still time, he was shocked when Vigna's gloomy expression changed, and she responds how she thought that it sounded interesting, and even wishes to fight one of the golems Grace mentioned. Grace thinks about how strong Vigna truly is, and tells himself that he shouldn't be that surprised since Vigna is their country's strongest knight. Vigna changed the topic and pointed out to Grace that the king himself had sent Grace his very own son to such a place. Grace responds, telling Vigna that she is correct. Hearing that same comment, Bowman states that it was far scarier than Asgard itself. Bowman tells Grace that he doesn't have to listen to what the king says. Bowman reassures Grace that if he sticks with him and Vigna, he will not die in vain. Bowman also told Grace that he didn't mind for them to make a detour and head to the nearby port instead. Vigna also agrees with what Bowman said. Hearing how loyal the two were, Grace thanks the two of them. However, Grace has no plans of doing what they suggested. Having been ordered by the king, governing Asgard is Grace's duty as a prince. Besides that, Grace was not feeling pessimistic at all. Knowing that he would be living alongside Bowman and Vigna, Grace is certain that his life will be more enjoyable than the days spent in the kingdom. If the two were willing, Grace states how he would be very happy to share his fate with them. Listening to Grace, Bowman responds that if that's what Grace wishes, then he will not stop him. Bowman was also very much intrigued by Suzi's relics. When Vigna said, "You really are," Grace responded with, "What?" But Vigna couldn't speak her thoughts and decided to be silent instead. During their journey, the three encountered and faced a huge canine. Fortunately, Vigna was able to take it down. Grace immediately took back what he had said and called the place they are currently at as Hell. Panicking, Grace suggests changing their names and living in some town instead. "Oh, you," says Vigna as she then asks Grace what happened to the big talk earlier. Bowman shares his worry, stating that it was much worse than he had expected, and that if it weren't for Vigna, then they would have already been monster food. Vigna, on the other hand, felt alive since it has been a while since she has moved her body that much. Looking at Grace's gloomy expression, Bowman calls and asks him if they are truly on the right path to the Mad King's mansion. Grace responds that according to the world map, they are on the right path. The mansion of the Mad King is said to be near the waterside. Thinking of the waterside, Grace's attention was more drawn towards the flower near it. Watermoon flower, which is often seen near water, is used as an ingredient in healing potions. To Grace's surprise, he immediately finds the watermoon flower and suggests that the two follow the flowers. The three followed their guts and naturally reached the Mad King's mansion. Vigna was very impressed with Grace as they really did reach the mansion just like Grace said. Grace finally let out a sigh of relief as they finally made it, and stated that the mansion is now their new base. Grace suggests that they proceed carefully as they don't know when the golems might attack. Grace orders Vigna to arm herself. Following Grace's order, Vigna gives herself magical enhancement by using Thunder Emperor's Arm. After heeding its call, Vigna pulls out her sword, which then shows that it is coated with lightning, as Vigna activated her full magical armament, showing why she is the strongest of the royal guards. Though Grace is with Vigna, he still couldn't help but think how doomed they are if their plans do not work. Grace halts and asks, "What's that?" "That." Puzzled, the three find a girl laying on the bed. Before Grace could say anything, Bowman cut him off as he stated that the girl was a golem. Grace was surprised at how the golem looked human. Bowman pointed out that with the mansion's current state, there's no way a normal human could remain intact. Bowman has an idea as to what they are seeing, and guesses that the golem is created by unknown technology, to which he states that he would love to see it in action. Grace wondered if the girl on the bed is truly a golem. After touching the golem's head, Grace's talent suddenly activates, transporting him back to the World Library. What puzzles Grace even more is that he was transported to a door which he has never noticed in the World Library before. Grace was then informed that he has encountered knowledge from another world, and that the World Library will now unlock part of that knowledge. While Grace's body stood still, Bowman tries to feed his curiosity and orders Vigna to infuse the golem with magic, stating that golems are moved by the use of magic. Vigna responds that she is already infusing the golem with magic. However, it is still not moving. Finally regaining consciousness, Grace informs the two that the power source isn't magic, and reveals that it uses electricity to move. Activating her magic, Vigna asks to confirm if she should use lightning magic on the golem. Using the Thunder Emperor's arm, Vigna had accidentally caused some damage to the mansion, to which she received an earful from Bowman, telling her to hold back her power as she may possibly break the golem. Annoyed, Vigna responded that she does not care and told Bowman to stop being so noisy. When everything finally settled down, Grace was shocked to see the golem now standing up. Seeing the golem standing up, Bowman was surprised and praised Vigna for doing a wonderful job. Vigna too thought that the result might be great, but she stated that she woke the golem up without thinking, and asked if that was really okay. As Grace remained silent, the golem finally spoke up, greeting everyone with a good morning and introducing itself as Galatea. She then corrected everyone, stating that she is no golem and is formally called a robot. Hearing this, both Vigna and Bowman were confused, asking what a robot is. Inside Grace's World Library, he learned that a robot is a mechanical doll that follows human commands and acts independently. It is a product of technology from another world, different from theirs. Curious about the other world, Grace told the World Library that it had never mentioned such things before. In response to Grace, the World Library stated that objects which the talent user does not even know exist are excluded from search results. However, by encountering the unknown before Grace's eyes and learning about the existence of the technology from another world, a new room of knowledge had been unlocked. Hearing it from the World Library came as a surprise to Grace, an unexpected harvest in a distant land. Under his father, Grace could not have realized the true nature of his talent. By encountering the unknown, the World Library grows even larger. Vigna asked Grace if it was safe to approach the robot. Grace reassured Vigna that it was fine as he had confirmed the safety through his World Library. Grace asked the two if they could keep watch outside for a bit. After getting a little privacy, Grace told Galatea that it was nice to meet her, to which he then introduced himself as the new Lord of Asgard. Grace asked Galatea if her master was Susie. "Affirmative," said Galatea as she stated that not only Susie was her master but also her father. However, since Galatea awoke with a new lord ruling the place, she had already assumed that her father had passed. Grace told the painful news to Galatea that her father had passed away several decades ago, and that as the new Lord of Asgard, he had awoken her. "I see," said Galatea, as she stated that moving forward, she would only recognize Grace, the one who reactivated her, as her new lord, and would only serve Grace. As the first resident of Asgard, Grace told Galatea that he would be counting on her. Being called a resident, Galatea asked Grace why she was counted as a resident. Grace asked Galatea if there was a problem with what he had said. Galatea explained that since she is a robot, she assumed that it would be more appropriate if she were to be used as a tool. Hearing this, Grace guessed that the Mad King must have cherished Galatea like a real daughter, as Grace could tell from how well preserved Galatea was. For Grace, he could not force himself to treat the previous lord's daughter like a mere tool. Curious about lots of things, Grace asks Galatea if she didn't mind being asked about a couple of things. Bowman returns and informs Grace that there was a monster outside. When Grace saw the monster Bowman was referring to, he was not expecting an ancient fire dragon. Grace didn't know Asgard had ancient creatures. Bowman asks if the dragon's territory is Asgard itself, pointing out how incredibly angry it is. Seeing the ancient dragon charging up a fire blast, Vigna orders everyone to get out of the way. Using the skill Water God's Breath, Vigna managed to block the dragon's fire blast. Worried for his friend, Grace calls Vigna's name. Vigna informs Grace that she barely blocked the attack, but she can't hold it out for long. While Vigna holds off the fire blast, she hopes that Grace would at least run away and survive. Grace tells Vigna that there was no way he could do what she was asking. Grace was stopped when Vigna shouted at him, calling him an idiot. Vigna reminded Grace of the promise they made. Vigna then orders Bowman to hold the fire blast for a little bit as she plans on chanting a higher level spell. Though Bowman raises his shield, he tells Vigna that he won't be able to hold it for long. Remembering his father and brother and everything that they said, Grace refuses to bow down to their words. Using his only available weapon, knowledge and thought, Grace was starting to get frustrated since nothing was coming up. Grace remembers that the technology that composes Galatea is incredible, but seeing how such technology hasn't been leaked outside made Grace think that instead of the powerful golem who is said to have killed many visitors, she may actually have been protecting Susie's relics from looters. If that were the case, Grace highly believes that the relics are in the mansion. Grace turns to Galatea, asking her if she has a way to deal with the dragon. Calling Grace my lord, Galatea asks Grace if he wishes to have the dragon eliminated. Grace wanted to know if there was an actual method, to which Galatea responded, of course. Following Grace's command, Galatea proceeds in eliminating the dragon. Grace witnessed how Galatea suddenly jumped, leaping towards the dragon and knocking it down with just one kick. Seeing this, everyone was left stunned, as they did not expect that the dragon would be defeated physically. Grace confirms his theory that the visitors of Asgard were killed by Galatea. Since the time when the Mad King Susie was alive, protecting the land has been one of Galatea's duties. During those times before shutting down, Galatea admits that she may have sent some looters back home a few times. Galatea changes the topic, stating how it is very important and requests compensation. Surprised, Grace asks what he can do. What surprised Grace even more is that the only compensation Galatea requested from him was a pat on the head like how her father used to do it. Patting Galatea's head, Grace asks if he is doing it correctly. Galatea responded that it is, and explained that having her head patted has a nostalgic sensation. An emotion called happiness is being detected in oneself. After Galatea thanked Grace, Bowman sees Vigna suppressing her jealousy, which he suggested that she should honestly say how she too wanted to be patted after working so hard. Frustrated, Vigna becomes embarrassed and ends up repeating what Bowman said. After receiving her compensation, Galatea proceeds to guide her new master, along with Bowman and Vigna, to her father's workshop. Opening the door, Galatea asks them to follow and enter the room. Everyone except for Vigna was very excited as they were about to see the workshop where Susie created Galatea. And so, the three began their journey into the unknown, not knowing that the encounters there would lead to an even greater turning point. Grace was really glad that Vigna came along, even though she was already with them. The Industrial Revolution begins with otherworld knowledge from the Outcast Skill World Library. Fire arrows? Shut up, this is a rifle. With Galatea pressing her hand on an object, a mysterious path suddenly unveiled. Shocked, Grace asked what he had just witnessed. Stairs that appeared where there was nothing before. Instead of getting scared of what is ahead, Grace happily went down first. Vigna pointed out how Grace is so excited. Bowman responded that such a reaction is to be expected since all boys love secret passages. Bowman also stated that he has never seen such door-opening technology before. A door that opens just by waving one's hand. Bowman asks Vigna her thoughts about it, but Vigna just responded, "Who knows?" Galatea informs everyone that it is still too early to be surprised. Opening the door, Grace was stunned and asked what he was seeing. With just one look, Bowman immediately recognized the object in front of them as a furnace. "This is Susie's workshop," says Grace. Bowman turns to Grace, asking him if there's anything he can find in the World Library. Touching the furnace, Grace also thought about a furnace and imagined how it would look so differently. Doors opened, and Grace is once again back in the World Library. Grace learned that Susie's furnace was created using knowledge from another world. The furnace has temperature control capabilities and can withstand any high temperature. Grace repeats what the World Library says about Susie's furnace and tells Bowman that it is what is said in the book. Hearing that, Bowman could only say, "Incredible." Bowman was so glad that he chose to join Grace to Asgard. Bowman could no longer stand idly and asks Galatea if he is allowed to touch it as well. Responding to Bowman's question, Galatea tells Bowman that he is allowed. Clueless about the furnace, Grace asks Bowman if it was really that amazing. In response, Bowman says that it is. Until now, the strong fire used in forging relied on magicians. It couldn't be adjusted, and there was a limit to the temperature that could be produced. With unlimited firepower and adjustable temperature, the range of things Bowman and everyone else can make is incomparable to before. With a cheerful smile, Bowman is certain that they can process any kind of metal as they please. Excited, Bowman states that he will start working immediately. Noticing Grace's smile, Galatea mentions how Grace looked very happy as well. Grace responds that he is. Ever since Grace's talent was revealed, the treatment he received from his relatives only got worse. During that time and situation, Bowman was different. Bowman approached Grace, asking him why he was so down. Feeling distant, Grace responded that it was nothing and that he is just disappointed about various things. Patting Grace's head, Bowman tells Grace there's no need to be disappointed, and that being able to look up anything is an enviable talent. Bowman pointed out to Grace that there are lots of clueless people in the country, including himself, and hopes that Grace would teach them all various things. Hearing that story, Galatea comments how Bowman is truly a kind person. Grace agrees and states that whenever Bowman is happy, he is happy as well. Galatea was about to tell Grace the reason why they came to the basement, but she was cut off as Grace assumed that it was to show them Susie's amazing workshop. Galatea responds that showing Susie's workshop is also part of the reason. Galatea shows Grace a box and hands it over to him. Grace asks what it was, to which Galatea explains that it was from her father, Susie, a letter that is to be entrusted to the next master. Opening the box, Grace mutters, "A letter from Susie." The contents of the letter say that if the letter has been read, it means that Grace has been acknowledged by Galatea, which also means that Susie has recognized Grace. Galatea has received instructions to entrust the letter to someone she acknowledged after Susie's passing. Susie is not certain if the person who will be acknowledged is a transfer from another world like him or just a local. Regardless, Susie has decided to entrust his tools from another world to whomever the next chosen ruler is. However, in return, Susie asks for one request to be fulfilled, and Grace is free to handle his request as he sees fit. In Susie's last message, he pleaded for the next master to take care of Galatea. After reading the letter, Grace becomes more confused with what Susie meant by local or transfer. What confuses Grace also are the other characters that he had no knowledge of, and he pretty much couldn't read the whole letter. What made Grace wonder more is if Galatea really acknowledged him, someone who was helpless when attacked by a dragon. Grace turns to Galatea, asking her where the tools from another world are mentioned in the letter. Pointing to a desk, Galatea tells Grace that it is on the desk. Upon opening the box, Grace was puzzled as he saw a gun inside but had no knowledge about it. "What is this?" says Grace as he is about to touch the gun. The moment Grace touched the gun, the World Library instantly informed him that it had encountered new knowledge of another world. By gaining a certain amount of knowledge about the other world, Grace's other world comprehension rank increases. With that, Grace could now search for technologies and phenomena related to the other world. Overflowing with information and new knowledge, Grace finally obtained the information about the gun inside the box. While holding the gun, Grace learns that it is a weapon from another world that uses gunpowder to fire bullets and has strong killing power. Breathing heavily, Grace's thoughts were filled with the weapon from another world. Galatea tells Grace that the gun is a weapon that only her master can use due to biometric authentication, which is also what she had heard from her father. Grace wondered if he should try using the weapon, since he is certain that no matter how powerful it will just be another wasted treasure if someone like him, who can barely use a sword or magic, were to use it. The moment Grace shot the gun, the sound echoed through the mansion, which Vigna also heard and wondered what created that sound. Seeing Grace tremble, Galatea asks him if he is alright. From what Galatea could tell, the recoil caused the gun barrel to hit Grace's forehead. In Grace's thoughts, it's only natural that Susie would appoint a guardian as capable as Galatea to protect his relics. Magic power, physical strength, talent. Grace is certain that none of those would matter if Susie's technology were to get out into the outside world. Galatea whispers to Grace's ears, telling him that she is interested in the world Grace will create. Galatea is very much intrigued as to how Grace would develop the country using her father's knowledge. To Grace, Vigna, and Bowman, the reason Galatea entrusted the three with her father's letter is because she believed that the three kind people who care for their comrades would surely make Asgard into a wonderful country. Hearing that, Grace remembered that their original goal was to develop Asgard. While everyone is busy cleaning up the debris and mess, Grace asked for everyone to listen and announced that by tomorrow, they will be starting the development of Asgard. Grace admits that they've experienced many unexpected events already ever since they came to Asgard. However, with Susie's relics, Grace hopes that it will help them in creating the best town using the technology from another world. Although Grace was so enthusiastic in sharing such news, he became embarrassed when Bowman mentioned that they will be needing to take care of food and clothing, as well as shelter first. Another problem Bowman pointed out was that the mansion itself is in ruins. Seeing that everyone is now all gathered in one place, Vigna appears and asks what's the reason why they are all gathered up. Grace asks Vigna where she had been. "Where? Well," says Vigna as she then surprised everyone by showing a piece of meat. Vigna went to get some dragon meat since there's only grass growing around the place. After cutting the dragon meat to pieces, Grace advised everyone to eat more meat to keep their strength up since they are going to be busy moving forward. However, after cooking up the meat, everyone was shocked as they saw the meat is now all black, even commenting that somehow it no longer looked appetizing. Picking up one of the skewers, Grace tells Vigna that the meat has completely burnt black, to which Vigna responds, "That's right, Grace then turns to Bowman and asks him if he had followed the instructions from the World Library on how to remove the small bones from the dragon. Responding to Grace's question, Bowman thought that he did. Curious, Grace asked everyone how they handle their meals in their kingdoms. Bowman responded that he always ate out. Vigna answered as well, stating that she is the same with Bowman, choosing to eat outside. Noticing Grace going silent, Vigna asks Grace why he is looking at them with such an expression. With a disappointed look, Grace responded, "Oh, it's nothing." Vigna understands what Grace is trying to say, but explains that they can't help it since they've only practiced swordsmanship and magic. Hearing this, Grace felt embarrassed in ordering a beginner to cook. Left with no other option, Grace tells everyone to wait as he will remake everything himself. Hearing this, Vigna's spirit brightened up as he asked Grace if he would really do that, and commented that he always loved Grace's cooking. After cooking for the two and handing them the meat, Vigna was full of praise, as she stated how she already expected for Grace's cooking to be the best. Bowman, who is also enjoying the food, agrees with Vigna. In a world that only valued strength, nothing else was ever encouraged. That was the way of the world that Grace's father created. Remembering Bowman's words before, asking for Grace to teach the clueless people in the country various things. And with Galatea, who's very much interested in the world Grace is trying to create. Staring at the gun, Grace was thinking about the world that he is aiming for. A few days later, Grace was busy with starting a farm. Exhausted, Grace guessed that he was mostly done with the plowing. Grace's attention was then called, asking for him to look at her direction. Slicing trees like butter, Vigna stated that the sword Bowman reforged for her was truly amazing and how the trees are being cut like grass. Ever since they obtained access to Susie's furnace, Bowman has been absorbed in metalworking experiments. Iron hoe, one of the products produced by Bowman using Susie's furnace. According to the World Library, the numbers directly represent performance. Verk's treasure sword is said to have only a plus 15 bonus, while the iron hoe had plus 30. By simple calculation, the iron hoe has twice the performance of Verk's treasure sword. Galatea brought Grace some refreshments, praising him for doing good work. Galatea then asks Grace if the work progress is going smoothly. Grace thanked Galatea for the drink and told her that thanks to Bowman's hoe, even someone like him made quick progress. Galatea wished that he could help them out. Unfortunately, she does not have any farming programs installed. Hearing this, Grace wondered what Galatea meant by programs installed. Grace tells Galatea that it is okay. With everyone already doing various things, Grace thought that he should at least do the plowing. In order to build the town, Grace and the others were all working hard to secure the minimum necessary supplies and a base. Bowman's task is repairing the mansion and manufacturing tools. Vigna was ordered to clear the forest and to create earthen walls with magic to ward off monsters. As for Grace, Galatea calls his attention and asks what he has been planting. Grace showed a potato and stated that he brought them from the country. Grace explains that while wheat is the staple food, he heard that in some regions they use potato as their main food source. Potatoes grow well in any soil and yield a large harvest. Grace pointed out that unlike meat, potatoes are easy to preserve. Impressed, Galatea comments how Grace is as knowledgeable as ever. Embarrassed, Grace asks Galatea if she actually thinks so. Grace stood up, as he guessed that he may be mostly done with planting. Galatea praises Grace for his good work and shares what her father used to say, which is that crops one worked hard to grow taste exceptionally good. Hearing this surprised Grace, as he never expected for Susie to do farming as well. Galatea responds that Susie did do farming and even had a vegetable garden as a hobby. What surprises Grace even more is when Galatea shares that Susie often hunts monsters to gather fertilizers. Grace wondered what a fertilizer was, and if it was knowledge from another world. Farming, tilling the soil, and planting the seeds. What Grace thought was the normal way is to dance in the fields and pray to the god of harvest. Thinking about it, Grace realized that it was embarrassing to ask again after pretending to be knowledgeable. Grace remembers that he can now search for more information and decides to try it out. Grace orders his world library to reveal more information about fertilizer. From what Grace read, he learned that fertilizers are nutrients that promote plant growth, made from animal excrement, bones, and ash. Fertilizers are used in agriculture in other worlds. I see, says Grace, as he realized that items whose existence is unknown are no longer excluded from search. Thinking if that is what it meant, Grace was now able to grasp a little bit of understanding on how the other world comprehension increases. Grace becomes more intrigued as to how far his skill could go if he were to encounter more knowledge from the other world. Galatea calls for Grace, asking him if he is all right. Surprised, Grace responds that he is. More importantly, Galatea, says Grace as he orders Galatea to bring him the parts of the dragon from before that can be used as fertilizer. Grace is certain that there are still some left from what Vigna processed. Hearing the order, Galatea immediately moved and told Grace to leave it up to her, wanting to be useful like everyone else. Knowing what he had asked from Galatea, Grace wondered if Galatea could actually do it. A few moments later, Grace mutters, No way, as he was shocked to see all the potatoes have already grown so much, even making him wonder if potatoes are supposed to grow that quickly. Exhausted, Vigna stated that she had finished building the wall. Vigna was stunned when she saw the harvested potatoes. Vigna then turns to Grace and asks to confirm if the crops are already ready for harvest. Seeing Vigna, Grace praises her for her hard work. Upon learning of the fertilizer, Vigna becomes more impressed with otherworld technology. Grace agrees and shared that according to the World Library, using dragon as fertilizer is most likely the cause for the super fast growth of the crops. Vigna cheers as she states that the development of their town starts with the dragon they defeated. With the group being able to harvest more than they can handle, Grace asks Vigna if she is hungry. Vigna responds that she is starving and exhausted after building the wall. Vigna's eyes glowed as she asks Grace if he is going to make something. However, Vigna's bright smile instantly vanishes when Grace tells her that she will make it instead of him. Vigna refuses to make anything to eat, reminding Grace how bad her cooking skills are, and the proof was the burnt skewers. Grace calms Vigna down, telling her that becoming strong is important, a saying that is encouraged above all else in the kingdom. Confused, Vigna tries to follow what Grace is trying to say. Grace then pointed out that in the kingdom, they are only taught things that are useful to the country, such as defeating enemies. To simplify what he is trying to relay, Grace tells Vigna that they can't do anything else. Shocked and confused, Vigna mutters, "Grace?" Grace then mentioned that such a way is how his father had operated the country. However, it is different in Asgard, the place he rules. For Grace, knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. Grace gave an example through cooking, stating that heating at high temperatures can aid digestion and prevent food poisoning. Curious, Vigna asks Grace for advice on what she should do. Showing a bright smile, Grace suggests that they boil some potatoes together. Seeing Vigna's confused look, Grace repeats himself and tells Vigna that they are going to boil potatoes. As the two started to boil some potatoes, Vigna noticed that the potatoes suddenly disappeared and accused Grace of snacking them. Grace explains to Vigna that she has put the heat too high. Cooking another batch, the fire was now lowered. But what surprises Vigna is that the potatoes somehow turned into rocks. Grace explains that they have not placed enough water. For the next batch, the two were then surprised when Vigna mentioned that the pot had turned into a forest. Several hours later, Grace and Vigna successfully boiled a potato. After breaking it apart and tasting it, Vigna asks Grace how it tasted. Grace showed a bright smile and told Vigna that the potato is delicious. Excited, Vigna asks Grace repeatedly if he speaks the truth. Grace hands the potato to Vigna, suggesting that she try it out for herself. Grace then states that crops that they worked hard to grow taste exceptionally good. Hearing the exact words Susie once said, Galatea felt happy, showing a faint smile. Vigna hesitates to eat the potato at first, but after taking her first bite, Vigna's doubts went away as she commented how delicious the potato was. Smiling at Vigna, Grace says to her, "Right?" The dragon Galatea defeated became fertilizer, which Grace then tilled the soil with the hoe Bowman made. With Vigna's cooking, Grace mentions how it is the crystallization of their efforts. Grace agrees with Vigna regarding the deliciousness of the potato. Seeing Grace's smile, Vigna's cheeks turned red. "Ha! Good grief," says Bowman as night comes and he is still surveying the mansion and fixing things that need fixing. Bowman comments how the mansion is too run down. After working so much, Bowman becomes hungry. Galatea calls Bowman's attention. When Bowman asks what she wanted, Galatea asks for Bowman if he does not mind waiting. Bowman then asks to wait for what? Opening the door slightly and peeking inside, Bowman finally realizes what Galatea is talking about. Impressed, Bowman tells Galatea, "You're a good one, aren't you?" In response, Galatea says that she is indeed, as she is an excellent robot. Memories of the old Asgard came to Galatea, remembering how the citizens would worry for her for carrying such heavy objects, receiving thanks for her help, being greeted by passers-by, and playing with the kids. For Galatea, everything that happened weren't just happy dreams, but rather happy memories. Grace asks Galatea if it was too painful for her, and suggests that they can continue without her. Galatea responded, "No," and clarified that although it's very different from the records before her hibernation, she wishes to engrave it firmly in her memory. Galatea called Grace and Vigna, asking for them to let her guide them through the village of Asgard. Grace, along with Vigna and Galatea, are now visiting what's left of the village near the mansion. A little while ago, on the night Grace and the others harvested lots of potatoes, Grace shared that his talent World Library can be strengthened. Grace explained further that by gaining new knowledge of the other world, he can enhance his library and acquire even more knowledge necessary for developing Asgard. Seeing how everyone is all busy eating and not listening, Grace calls for Vigna, asking her if she was even listening. However, Vigna just responded that the food was so delicious that she couldn't stop. Vigna pointed out how Grace's potato dish is too delicious, which ended up with her not listening at all. Hearing such praise, Grace guessed that not listening due to that reason was understandable, and asks for Vigna to eat more. Receiving permission to eat more excites Vigna. Bowman, on the other hand, listened to everything that Grace said and was about to summarize what he understood. Surprised hearing Bowman speak, Grace mentions Bowman's name. However, when Bowman explained his understanding, it was all garbled up due to him explaining while chewing the food. Seeing this, Grace asks for Bowman to not talk with his mouth full. Bowman apologizes and explains that he has been working all day and was now starving. "Honestly, what am I going to do with you two?" says Grace as he gives more potatoes to the two and asks for them to eat more. Galatea joins in and repeats what Grace stated, which is to raise the level of other-world knowledge in the World Library, in order to gain knowledge for developing Asgard. To obtain more information, Galatea believes that Grace would have interacted more with Susie's relics. Galatea asks Grace if what she said was correct. Seeing how someone actually understood his intentions and plans, Grace couldn't help but clasp his hands together, thanking God for Galatea. Grace then informs the two that in the mansion, apart from Galatea herself, Susie's furnace, and one otherworldly weapon, there were no other relics. However, Grace believes that there might still be something left in the nearby village. Grace then asks Galatea if he is correct, to which Galatea responds yes. When Grace finally relays the plan, both Vigna and Bowman were eager to hear more. Grace informs the two that they will be exploring the village tomorrow. Returning to the present, Vigna calls for Grace, telling him that the objects they just passed by are a monster's scale. Grace picks the scale up and immediately becomes worried. Vigna was starting to regret that they did not bring Bowman with them. Grace explained how Bowman seemed to be so busy with experiments on the furnace. Observing their surroundings, Vigna could only comment on how terrible of a state the place has become. Grace agrees and shares what he read in the library, which is that Asgard had fallen. Seeing how the mansion was relatively intact, Grace thought that the nearby village would still be intact the same as the mansion. Unfortunately, that was not the case, as Grace was just as surprised after seeing such devastation. Vigna remembered that Galatea was tasked to protect Asgard, which she then asked Galatea how the place ended up in such a mess. Galatea was entrusted with the duty to protect the place, but as her power source ran out, Galatea entered a state of hibernation. Galatea could only guess that the residents may have abandoned the place after her hibernation. Galatea suspected that without her or her father, it became difficult for the citizens to protect themselves from the many monsters inhabiting the land, and thieves targeting Susie's relics. Hearing Galatea's point of view, Vigna then understood why the mansion was relatively unscathed and believed that it was also because that old spark was there. All of a sudden, Vigna tells Galatea, "No, it's okay." Puzzled, Galatea asks Vigna what she meant. Vigna tells Galatea that they are now her comrades and they will easily drive away any monster or thieves. With that in mind, Vigna hoped that Galatea would cheer up. Galatea was thankful for Vigna, but after seeing the scene again, Galatea's thoughts have changed a bit. Seeing the destruction and what was left of her beloved town, Galatea is certain that development is impossible, and it would only cause Grace and the others tremendous hardship. Hearing this, Vigna agrees that the process will be challenging. Vigna then informs Galatea that whenever Grace says he'll do something, he makes sure that the goal will be achieved. Vigna also reassures that both her and Bowman have the same mindset. Grace returned to the group after exploring and apologized for keeping them waiting. Seeing how Grace is carrying and wearing tons of treasures, Vigna asks him what was going on and if he stole all those treasures. Grace responds that it is not a nice way to put it and clarifies that he did not steal anything. Grace then asks for the two to look carefully, as he stated that there are still many valuable things inside. Grace told the two that they came all that way to find things useful for development, which he believes that they can't go back empty-handed. Out of all the treasures that Grace gathered, one struck Galatea most. Seeing Galatea's weird action, Vigna asks her what was wrong. Galatea calls Grace, telling him about the cup. Curious, Grace asks Galatea if she was referring to the cup near him. As soon as Grace touched the cup, he instantly gained knowledge of the other world. Due to obtaining a certain level of knowledge about the other world, Grace's otherworld comprehension rank increased. Grace was shocked to discover a new room of knowledge after touching Susie's cup. After looking further into what he may have touched, Grace learned that it was made of alloy, a combination of metal with other metals or non-metals. Reading the vague explanation made Grace think that it is the same with guns. Even if Grace were to understand the materials and usage, it seemed to him that a high rank of other-world comprehension is required for the creation method. Grace finally returned to his body after Vigna called his name multiple times, responding to her, "Ah, yes, sorry." Grace turns to Galatea as he was about to know more about the cup. "Yes," says Galatea, as she explained that it is a relic from her father. It was an item that Susie distributed to the people to celebrate Galatea's birthday. Staring at the cup, Galatea stated that it is a very important memento for her. Looking at Galatea reminiscing, Vigna tells her how relieved they are for her. Vigna then asks Galatea if the woman in the cup was her, to which Galatea responds that it is indeed her. Vigna gets closer, patting Galatea's head and telling her that she sure does have a doting father. "The people resemble their king," says Galatea, as she stated that it was a phrase that her father used to say often. In the royal capital, everyone had the same wide-eyed stare at the king, which scared Galatea. Hearing that, Vigna guessed that Asgard must have been a really wonderful place. While checking his clothing, Grace suddenly heard a rustling noise. Upon turning around, Grace sees an eye in the bushes. As the monster reveals itself, Grace learns that it was an armored armadillo, a magical beast with scales that repel magic and claws that can tear through iron. A famous trait the beast has is that it has a ferocious temperament. Seeing that it was a scaly monster, Vigna immediately charges in and orders Grace to stand back. Vigna accuses the armored armadillo as the monster that ravaged the village. After finally locating the monster, Vigna instantly used her Thunder Emperor's arm. Grace asks for Vigna to wait as he explains to her what the monster is. However, it was too late for Grace as Vigna made contact. A look of confusion was painted on Vigna's face as she saw how her thunderous needle didn't work. Vigna jumped back and stated that her lightning-clad sword isn't working. Galatea moved forward and told Vigna to let her handle it. Full of anger, Galatea tells the armored armadillo, "How dare you attack the village," before punching the beast and knocking off some of its scales. Galatea informs Vigna that she has now destroyed the armored scales and that she may now take her chance. Still shocked after witnessing Galatea's impressive firepower, Vigna responds, "I got it." Using her Thunder Emperor's arm, Thunderous Breakthrough, Vigna successfully pierced through the armored armadillo. While helping Galatea to stand up, Vigna tells her that they really did it. Galatea warned Vigna of the monster behind her and to watch out. However, since Vigna was too slow to react, Galatea pulled her away and took on the beast's attack. After stopping the armadillo's attack, Galatea asks Vigna if she is alright. Vigna responds that she is, but was shocked when a third armored armadillo appeared. The third armadillo ended up pinning Vigna down, while Galatea was still holding off the second armadillo. Realizing that she has lost her footing, Galatea was certain that it was because of the impact from earlier damage. Before Galatea gets rolled over by the armored armadillo, Grace steps in and pushes her away. Feeling a little bit of pain, Grace asks Galatea if she is okay. Seeing Grace in the battle made Galatea confused and told Grace that it's dangerous, asking him why he even moved closer. Grace becomes confused as to why Galatea would do such a thing. Grace points out that it is only natural to help his comrades. After stopping the third armadillo, Vigna didn't expect to learn that the armadillo she stopped was already dead. Turning to Galatea, Vigna was shocked when she saw Grace standing in between. Another reason why Grace stepped in, he reminded Galatea of a task that he took from Susie after being acknowledged by her as her new master, which is to take care of Galatea. Hearing that from Grace, Galatea remembers what Vigna said, which is that Grace is a man who does what he says he'll do. In front of the armored armadillo, Grace pulls out the gun Susie left. Both Grace and the armored armadillo are now in a standoff. Shooting at the armored armadillo's head at such a close range, Grace successfully finished the beast's life off. Seeing the weapon's destructive power, Grace could only comment on how it had such incredible power. Worried for Grace's safety, Vigna hurriedly ran towards him, asking Grace if he was hurt and if he was alright. In response, Grace asked Vigna if she was alright. Changing the conversation, Vigna asked a more important question, which was if Grace was okay to fight. "Well, yeah," says Grace, as he stated that he felt like he had gained a new ability after mastering how to use the gun at the library. "You idiot," says Vigna, as she scolds Grace and tells him that he could have said so earlier that he can fight, making Vigna worry over nothing. Grace apologizes to Vigna and tells her that she's a bit close. Grace turns to Galatea, asking her if she was alright. All of a sudden, Galatea too got close to Grace, which puzzled Grace, and he asked Galatea what was wrong. In front of Grace and Vigna, Galatea apologizes to them for losing her composure. Galatea then mentioned the gun Grace was holding and shared that when her father entrusted the weapon and letter to her, Susie was already an elderly person. With that reason, Galatea eventually entered a dormant state. When Grace's group woke Galatea up, she was already prepared for the fact that her human father had passed away. However, now that Galatea has a new master to serve, along with Vigna and Bowman, she still struggled to hold on to hope for the future and wasn't able to see the reality much clearly. Looking at the ruins of the old Asgard, Galatea could only say that nothing remains in Asgard anymore. Even though Asgard is said to be a rich land in the state, there are also monsters and many unknown things, which include herself. Galatea asks Grace and the others if it was really alright for them to truly lend a hand. Patting Galatea's head, "Of course it is," says Grace as he told Galatea that it is the reason why they are at Asgard in the first place. Grace turns to Vigna asking her if he was wrong, to which Vigna responds that Grace is correct. Grace promises Galatea that they will figure something out. Filled with hope again, Galatea thanks Grace. Vigna tells Galatea to wipe her nose off, to which Galatea apologizes for showing such an act despite her being a robot. Later that night, Grace apologizes for bringing up such a topic so soon. but feels that it is also urgent that everyone must know. Holding the cup, Grace informs them that the cup is apparently called an alloy. Sharing his notes, Grace informed everyone that that is the only knowledge he can obtain since his rank is too low. Due to low rank, the manufacturing process of the alloy is quite vague. Grace thought that Bowman might know something. However, Bowman responded that if Grace doesn't understand the knowledge, there is no way for him to understand it as well. As a mere blacksmith, Bowman admits that he has worked with all sorts of metals. However, he has never seen such a metal like the alloy before. From what Bowman observed, the material is light yet still quite strong. Finding the alloy cup very interesting, Bowman asks Grace if he can take it apart to experiment. Hey, Bowman, says Grace as he informs Bowman that the cup is an important memento for Galatea, and warns Bowman to not even think about taking the cup apart. Realizing his mistake, Bowman responds, "Oh right, my bad." Galatea spoke up and said no, clarifying that she is allowing for the cup to be experimented on as long as it can be of use. Muttering Galatea's name, Bowman thanks her for giving them permission. The next day, Grace was woken up by someone calling his name. Grace assumes that it was Vigna and asks her to let him sleep a little longer. Bowman reveals himself and tells Grace that it was him that called his name. Grace was shocked seeing Bowman's face first thing in the morning. Since it is quite rare for Bowman to wake Grace up, Grace asks him if he even slept, to which Bowman responds that he did not. However, thanks to that, Bowman shares the news to Grace that he has finally done it. Confused, Grace asks Bowman what he meant by done. Bowman noticed that the alloy is combed with two elements, which are lightness and durability. Bowman borrowed part of the container's handle to examine, which he then tried combining iron and mithril, which he is familiar with. From what Bowman observed, mixing one metal with another substance to give it new properties is pretty much what describes an alloy. Surprised, Grace was certain that what Bowman said was not included in the library description on how to make alloys. Touching the wires Bowman made, Grace asked the World Library to reveal more information about the wire. The World Library informed Grace that the material is called mithril alloy, an alloy of iron and mithril. By combining mithril, which has high magical conductivity, with easily processed iron, magical equipment can now be manufactured more easily and at a lower cost. What surprised Grace is that Bowman's name appeared in the World Library's information as the inventor of mithril alloy. Intrigued, Bowman also checks the book and sees his name written down. It then made Bowman wonder if he had left a small mark in history as a blacksmith. Grace responds that what Bowman left is not just a small mark, but rather a huge step. Holding on to the small piece of mithril alloy, Grace mentions that with an invention like that, the restoration of Asgard may no longer be just a dream. Grace has obtained a new important material, which is the mithril alloy. Another material Grace also obtained is the scales of the armored armadillo, which are said to have strength equivalent to 5 iron plates stacked together, a highly valued material for armor. Grace was also able to test out Susie's gun, and learned that it had enough destructive power to penetrate an armored armadillo. For the land of Asgard, Grace is certain that when subjects start to settle, they will likely live in the village. Since many monsters still lurk, Grace was already planning on making countermeasures, which he deemed to be very essential. Grace also asked Bowman himself to replicate the items. Vigna keeps calling for Grace's name, trying to get his attention. When Vigna asks Grace why he is grinning while staring at metal scraps, Grace responds with, Vigna was starting to get worried for Grace, calling him a pervert for showing such a reaction. Hurt by the comment, Grace asks Vigna to not call him a pervert. Grace explains the reason why he is smiling, and it was because of the mithril alloy he is holding, calling it an innovative invention. Puzzled, Vigna asks what the alloy is. Grace further explained that it is a technique of combining different metals to create new properties. The alloy maintains mithril's magical conductivity while being easier to process and cheaper. Staring at the small scrap of metal, Vigna was surprised to learn that such a small material is highly valuable. Vigna stated how impossible it was, since mithril itself is already difficult to work with. Vigna shares that the craftsman who made her sword mentioned how he struggled to process it with mithril. Handing the scrap of metal, Grace asks Vigna if she wishes to try it herself. Using the Thunder Emperor's arm on the metal scrap, Vigna was surprised as she admits that the small piece of metal really does contain mithril. What Grace liked the most is the price. Grace admits that the mithril alloy's performance is inferior to pure mithril, but it is easy to work with and they can make equipment cheaper with expensive pure mithril. Grace calls it a groundbreaking invention. Vigna's attention was drawn elsewhere and told Grace that their guests may have finally arrived. Looking at his garden, Grace becomes enraged after seeing a group of goblins jump over their earth wall and are taking their crops. In a fit of rage, Grace starts charging towards the goblins, telling them to stop harvesting his precious crops without his permission. However, the goblins were not afraid of Grace. With their clubs, the goblins leap onto Grace, which caught him by surprise. Though the goblins are weak individually, they are mostly known to excel when in group behavior. Pulling out her sword, Vigna instantly took care of the two goblins with her swift movements. Vigna informs Grace that the goblins are pretty weak against strong opponents, which is why they avoid dangerous places. Calling the goblins weak, Grace looks up and sees that there's no end to them. Grace believes that the reason is because they couldn't exterminate all of the goblins when they saw them before. Vigna tells Grace to leave it up to her. Vigna could no longer hold her anger as she saw how the goblins are easily stealing the fruits of their labor. "How dare you?" says Vigna as she uses the Thunder Emperor's arm, Thunderous Rain. The skill was so powerful that even Grace couldn't believe that Vigna would use such a powerful skill on goblins. As Grace heard how Vigna mocked and insulted the goblins, he remained speechless. Seeing how Vigna annihilated the goblins except for one, Grace asks for Vigna to wait and to not kill the remaining goblin. Grace orders Vigna to let the last goblin escape. Vigna smiles as she tells Grace that he is truly smart. From Vigna's understanding, they will be cornering the goblins to their nest and wiping them out completely. Hearing that, Grace responds that they will be doing no such thing, and points out how scary of a plan it is. Grace explains that goblins never approach a place they deem dangerous again, which Grace believes means the only goblin left will serve as a goblin repellent. Grace still believes that they have to do something, as he is certain that there is more than one goblin settlement. Vigna suggests adding spikes to the wall like the clubs that the goblins are using. Vigna wonders if that idea would make the wall easier to climb. Hearing that, Grace responds, "That's it." Puzzled, Vigna asks Grace if he had thought of something. Grace suddenly runs off somewhere, asking for Vigna to wait a little. Thinking of the mithril alloy, Grace was very eager to show his new idea, an invention that will go down in the World Library. Several days later, a couple of goblins returned to Asgard territory and noticed that something new was added on top of the wall. Observing all this, Vigna asks if those goblins outside are from another settlement. Vigna stated that the goblins are a step too late, as she believes that the goblins won't be able to invade them now. Grace agrees, as he is certain that goblins too must dislike pain. With his attention being called, Grace turns and sees that it was Galatea, asking him if that was a new invention. Grace responded that it is. Grace explains that by lining the top of the wall with mithril alloy spikes, they can prevent goblins from climbing over. "I see," Galatea says. Vigna calls Grace's attention, asking him if that is going to be okay. Grace responds that it is. Witnessing how the goblins do their best to get over the fenced wall by climbing onto each other, Grace states that it's all taken care of. Vigna wonders just how badly the goblins want potatoes. Grace had no doubts that the goblins would seek out the potatoes since they are of top quality. Grace suggests that they observe, as he reveals that the iron fence has another trick. The mithril alloy, like pure mithril, can store magical energy. The mithril alloy placed on the wall currently is charged with Vigna's lightning magic. Hearing a bzzzt sound, Vigna and Grace witnessed how all the goblins were electrocuted as soon as they made contact with the fence. Experiencing such harsh defeat, the goblins decided to leave. Grace laughs as he points out how the goblins were now running away scared. Vigna, too, thought that it was a delightful scene. Calling Grace's attention, Galatea informs him that though they made such an effort to make the fence, she points out that one goblin managed to get through. "Oops," says Grace as he guessed that there were just too many goblins. Vigna tells Grace that it is fine as she comments how it is actually a good thing if one or two goblins pass through. Confused, Grace asks why it is a good thing. Smiling, Vigna tells Grace that they need to catch and hang them up. Vigna believes that it will be tough to do a lot at once, but with the device Grace made, it will make the task more easy. Hearing such horrible acts, both Grace and Galatea were speechless. Vigna states that if they catch the goblins little by little and hang them up in order, goblins will never come near their city again, which will make them have the strongest wall ever. Grace tells Vigna that her ideas are as frightening as ever. Grace tells Vigna that they can think about that later, and changes the focus back to his new invention, which he plans in calling as Guardian's Chain. However, Vigna was not on board with the name, calling it a lame name. Galatea tells Grace that it was a wonderful barbed wire, but then corrects herself and changes it to an electric fence. Galatea believes that the new invention will protect their crops from goblin damage. Grace agrees, but then stops, turning to Galatea and asking her about the barbed wire and electric fence. Grace asks what those names were and if what he invented already exists. Surprised, Galatea could only respond, "Eh? Ah." Galatea reveals that her father, Susie, used something similar in his home garden. Later that day, Vigna was surprised and asked Grace what he was doing down on the floor, and reminded him that it was already dinner time. Grace felt down as he assumed that his invention was a groundbreaking idea. Vigna asks Grace if he is still on about that. Galatea appears and apologizes to Grace. Vigna points out that the fault does not lie on Galatea, and that Grace is just moping on his own. Grace wanted to say more about it, but decided to let it go, agreeing to set aside as to who invented the fence for now. Grace then asks the two of them their opinion. stating the mysterious potatoes that restore magical power, technology for creating cheap mithril alloy, and rare monster materials, to which all are novel items. That's right, says Grace as he points out how they've been trying all those things for the betterment of their life in Asgard. But in order for things to go well, Grace believes that they would have to go through external trade. To achieve that step, Grace informs the two that they should be able to raise funds for developments. Now then, says Grace as he and Vigna visited another town to make some negotiations. A map shows the western region of Asgard's territory, the Notrina domain. For daily necessities such as food, building materials, warriors, and amongst other things, Grace and the others needed funds to procure supplies to continue developing Asgard, which has returned to nature, which is why Vigna and Grace are now at Azur Trading Company, which is said to be the largest in Notrina. Here we go, says the head of the Notrina Trading Company as she asks Grace if they should start things now. Offered with the finest herbal tea, Grace thanks the server. Before Grace could have a sip of the tea and thank them for the refreshments, he stopped, as they did not expect that the head of the company would suddenly take and drink it. Grace guessed that the herbal tea was meant for the owner in the first place, which she then asked Grace what had brought them to their company. Removing his hat, the woman confirms that she is indeed dealing with Prince Grace Vermillion, third prince of the Vermillion Kingdom. For their negotiations, Grace wanted for the trading company to purchase some monster materials. Materials, you say? Says the woman, as she happily obliged to take a look at the materials Grace brought. The woman stutters first as she picks up the material and thinks of them as pebbles, and even thought that they would skip well on water. Hearing this, Grace was greatly disappointed. Grace explains that the material he brought are ancient fire dragon scales. Hearing that it came from an ancient fire dragon, the woman scoffs and tells Grace to stop joking around. The woman then told Grace that it is impossible to defeat an ancient fire dragon in Asgard, where the dragons are said to live. The ancient fire dragons are deemed so dangerous that the private soldiers of the trading company can't even go near them. The woman finds it so troubling as she could no longer believe Grace's lies even if he is royalty. Grace asks the woman, confirming if she was truly an appraiser. Grace then informs the woman that he would like for them to properly appraise the materials. "Excuse me," says Grace as he enters a shop. Pleased to make an acquaintance, Grace introduces himself as the Lord of Asgard and wishes to discuss some trade matters. The receptionist looked puzzled after hearing that Grace introduced himself as the Lord of Asgard. The receptionist asks for Grace to wait for a moment, to which Grace thanked the receptionist. As Grace and Vigna sat, he observed the surroundings and found the interior of the shop quite strange. What Grace noticed right away are the walls and ceilings that are made of good materials, but the chairs and tables seem to hastily be put together with cheap items. Seeing some charred spots on the walls, Grace wonders if those were traces of magic. From what Grace thought, the shop looked like they were somewhat attacked by thieves. A man appeared, apologizing to Grace for making him wait. The man then introduces himself as Edward Harrison, the head of the Harrison Trading Company. "It's a pleasure to meet you," says Edward, as Grace responds, likewise, to Edward. Going straight to the point, Grace tells Edward that he came to sell them some items. "Yes, of course," says Edward, and calls for Chris and orders him to bring them some for their two guests. Edward apologizes for their cheap furnishings, but was somewhat puzzled when he saw Grace and Vigna looked extremely pleased. After being handed their teas, Vigna was surprised and told Grace that they were actually offered tea. Grace asks if it was really okay for them to have such warm tea. Vigna notices Chris looking at her, which she then asks what the problem was. Chris explains how she just noticed Vigna's unusual hair color. Chris shares how it is a first for her to see such a color, which surprises her to see how beautiful a light blue hair would look like. Seeing how Vigna stares back at her, Chris notices how Vigna isn't calling her a cursed child and clarifies that she does not care about such a term. Vigna finally spoke, confirming Chris's name and thanking her for the compliment. Vigna shares that it's only the second time that she has been called beautiful. Chris was surprised to hear that she was the second person, making her wonder as to who would be the first person. Looking at how Vigna stared at Grace, Chris immediately understood as to who the first person was. Wanting to clear any confusion, Edward asks Grace if he is truly the Grace who is the third prince of Vermillion. When Grace responded that he is indeed Grace Vermillion, Edward then changed the topic, asking how Bowman is doing. This surprised Grace and he asked Edward if he knew Bowman. Edward reveals that their company was indebted to Bowman in the past. Edward often heard about Grace's achievements through Bowman's letters, but after receiving a letter from Bowman saying that he is headed to Asgard with Grace, Edward then loses contact with Bowman. "I see," says Grace as he shares that Bowman is still as energetic as ever. Hearing that, Edward responded that it was wonderful to hear. Grace never expected that they would receive proper treatment unlike the other companies because of Bowman's connections. With that in mind, Grace was thinking of buying some rare materials for Bowman as a souvenir. Edward asked to be excused as he wishes to start appraising the items Grace had brought. Hearing this, Grace responds, "Please do," In just a matter of seconds, Edward picks up the scale and was astounded, seeing that it was the real deal, an ancient fire dragon scale. Edward admits that he has never seen a genuine ancient fire dragon scale, not since his grandfather's time. Grace too was surprised that Edward could tell that the material is genuine right away. Grace shares how they've been to several trading companies and have been told countless times that the materials they brought were fake. Hearing that, Edward tells Grace that he can't blame the other trading companies for doubting the material, since the very existence of ancient fire dragons is already rare to begin with. The materials are so rare that they may as well be displayed in a museum. Edward also isn't surprised if he was told that they are fake. Grace asks Edward, confirming that he can actually tell that the scale is genuine. Edward responds that he can use one of his skills, which he deemed to be very useless in battle. However, it is one of his few talents that he also deemed useful, his appraisal eye. Changing the topic, since Grace brought genuine materials, Edward asks him if they defeated the monsters in Asgard. When Grace responds that they have and that lots of things happened as well, Edward becomes more intrigued, and finally sees why Bowman praises Grace. Seeing how Edward seemed to have a grasp of the true value of an item, Grace then shows the other items he had brought. Seeing the contents of the case, Edward mutters, "This is..." Grace shares that those are a specialty product from Asgard and wondered if he could sell them to Edward. After thinking about what Grace said, Edward asks Grace if he does not mind him using his appraisal skill on the items. Edward was shocked, as he couldn't believe that the small item he was holding was actual mithril. To be able to process it so small, Edward asks how it was possibly done. Edward even starts to wonder if it was even possible to make such a thing using Bowman's skills. Edward is certain that the item will revolutionize the concept of magical equipment, a true bundle of possibilities. Grace then informs Edward about the potatoes, and suggests that he will understand much faster if he actually tastes them. Grace had already prepared some that were cooked, which Vigna shares that he made into eudaimoni. After receiving the potato from Vigna and taking a bite from it, both Edward and Chris were surprised at how delicious it was. Edward instantly could tell that it wasn't just the taste, as he can also feel his magic power that was depleted by the appraisal eye recovering. Edward never expected that a mere potato could become a new means of recovering magic power besides potions, which he then asks Grace how on earth he created such a thing. Grace apologizes as he could not divulge such a secret. "I see," says Edward, as he offers Grace 50 gold coins for all the materials he brought. Seeing the amount of money on the table, both Grace and Vigna's eyes instantly shimmered. Grace asks Edward if it was really okay to give them that much. Edward reassures Grace that the items he had brought are certainly worth that much. Edward informs Grace that if he were to sell such items regularly, then he would be willing to pay even more. Chris grows concerned, telling Edward about the money. However, Edward reassures Chris that it is all right. Seeing that, Grace asks if there are any problems. Edward responds that it is nothing significant, revealing that the money he offered is all of his current assets. Grace asks Edward if he was sure with his offer and if it wouldn't affect his business. Edward tells Grace that there was no need for him to worry, as he stated that if he can't make a profit with such wonderful products, then he is simply unfit to be a merchant. Grace froze after hearing Edward's words. Edward then informs Grace that if he still has more to offer, he would take them. Grace was beyond grateful, thanking Edward. Grace reveals how they are short on daily necessities and believes that it would be helpful for them if Edward could sell their products regularly. "I see," says Edward as he reassures Grace that he will arrange for that arrangement. After being handed a piece of paper by Grace, Edward asks what it was. Grace informs Edward that the paper shows the safe land route to Asgard. Grace also informs Edward that they are currently recruiting residents and are prepared to accept anyone. With that information, Grace hopes that Edward would spread the word in Notrina that they are looking for immigrants and to give the map to those who are interested. Wanting to respond to Grace's trust, Edward asks Grace if he can shake his hand. After the two shook hands, Edward suggests to Grace that they seal the deal, as he now looks forward to a long and prosperous relationship. With Grace drained from the negotiations, Vigna cheerfully tells Grace, "That's great." Grace too felt the same way, as he admits how he wasn't sure things would turn out. Vigna approaches Edward and Chris, thanking them for taking care of even the smallest details. Edward responds that it was only natural and how they are looking forward to a long-term relationship. Edward whispers, telling Vigna that they too must strive to be cherished by Grace, just like his wife. Hearing that, Vigna turns red as she asks Edward if the wife he is referring to is her. Vigna then informs Edward that he may be misunderstanding something. Puzzled, Edward asks if that was truly not the case. However, Edward stated that it was just what his appraisal skill indicated. Vigna was shocked and asked if even the appraisal eye could tell such information. Chris too was surprised, asking Vigna if Grace and her are not yet dating. "What's with you two?" says Vigna as she tries to explain that her relationship with Grace isn't like that. Chris calls Vigna's name and tells her that she would be happy to help her with anything regarding Grace. Vigna turns to Chris. asking her if she would really do that. Chris reassures Vigna that she will, sharing how love-related businesses are quite profitable. Shocked, Vigna tells Chris that she's got quite the business sense. While Chris is busy interacting with Vigna, Edward approaches Grace, asking for a moment of his time. Grace asks Edward what it is about. Edward first apologizes for disturbing his rest and tells Grace that it is something he wanted to discuss regarding his older brother. Edward shares that in the past, their company had dealings with the second prince, Kyle Vermillion. Since Kyle's approach was one-sided, Edward made it simpler for Grace to understand that they suffered significant loss because of it. Grace finally understands why the place looked as it is, which he then apologizes for his brother's actions. "Not at all," says Edward as he tells Grace that an apology wasn't necessary since the dealings they had with Grace were the complete opposite, which truly excites Edward. From what Edward heard, Kyle is currently on good terms with Azure Trading Company, a large company. Edward believes that the reason is the high-grade potion market, which the company is currently monopolizing. However, if Edward can continue trading with Grace in the future, he believes that it is possible for him to crush the Azure Trading Company. Understanding Edward's plan, Grace too agreed how exciting the future entails for the both of them. With Vigna commenting how the two both look scary, Grace and Edward's business deal then reached its conclusion.